make a start. The first bit's a little bit of introduction anyway, so if people join, that'll be fine. If you do have any questions, do sort of stick them into the chat, because I'll try and keep an eye on it, try and answer things as we go through. If you could please remain muted and keep your video off. If you do need to interrupt because you think I've made something completely wrong, then please do. But if we can sort of keep ourselves muted and our videos off, that will preserve the bandwidth and hopefully mean that we don't have any dropouts this afternoon. I am recording the meeting or this session, so if you do have to drop off for another call or something, then you can hopefully catch up later, or if you not managed to make it, then you might be watching this on the recording. So as I said on the first thing, this is not a formal training course. It is just me sharing a little bit of knowledge, hopefully, which is entertaining and interesting for you, and perhaps approaching things in a slightly different way. But just before this call, I was on another call where we are continuing to work on some of the e-learning modules and get the training sorted out for that and the exercises. And so if you're interested in helping with the development of that or checking some of the material, feeding back on whether it's good, then Catherine will always be interested to hear from you. And so we're hoping that towards the summer, we'll get those launched, and that will then be part of your CPD going forward. So as I think most of you will know, ETCS, European Train Control System, is defined in the CCS TSI, the Control, Command and Signalling Technical Specification for Interoperability. And within that document, it tells us the specifications to which ETCS has to be built and is to operate. There are 3 sets of specifications in the TSI. The latest version, set of specifications 3, is the one which is known as Baseline 3 Release 2, and it is the version which is currently being supported. It's a little bit like Microsoft. Yes, some people still have got XP or Windows 95 running, but Microsoft no longer supports it. They now only support Windows 10 and begrudgingly a little bit of Windows 8. So those are the specifications. And for those of you who like to fall asleep easily at night, reading one of the specifications is always a good way to do that, because they can be a little bit impenetrable. Subsets are about like that Vogon poetry. They're pretty impenetrable and pretty painful to read. It doesn't help that quite often the English is, well, we recognize the words, but sometimes we don't really recognize how they're written. The other thing when you're reading the subsets is to remember that they are written from the perspective of the ETCS onboard. There's actually very little in them about how the trackside should behave. So we have a lot of documentation describing the detailed behavior of the onboard and a few little hints about how the trackside should be designed. And the subsets can often be very confusing. It can be hard to find what you're looking for. It's a little bit like a maze. Our little mouse here is desperately trying to find the cheese, a little bit like the mouse that seems to be running around our house at night at the moment and has managed to work out how to get the cheese out of the trap without getting caught. But enough of that, let's go into the maze. Well, the first thing in a maze is, where am I? So knowing our way around the documentation is quite key. And one of the things that the onboard needs to know is where it is. And in the first session, we talked about how it locates itself to balise groups, and the last relevant balise group. It needs to know how fast it is going through the maze, our little mouse running around. and it needs to know what instructions it has in order to find its way through the maze. And for those of you familiar with mazes, you may know there is a rule that you can put your right hand onto the hedge, and if you follow that, eventually you'll get to the middle, unless, of course, it's one of those nasty mazes where that principle doesn't work. And we need to know which way we're going to go. So the ETCS onboard is looking for a lot of instructions from the trackside. When it gets those, it will then apply them in accordance with the instruction manual, which is the subsets. Subset 26 is the core document, the System Requirements Specification, but there are a plethora of other documents that apply to the onboard, and just a few of them are on the screen. And if you do decide to sit down and read these, it'll be a little bit like that large book that you take on holiday that you've always said you want to read, and you get about as far as page 5 and then fall asleep on the sun lounger and never finish it. For most of us, the subsets are pretty impenetrable, and even the people who are experts at it sometimes fail to find the things they're looking for first time. It's not uncommon in European meetings for everyone to be going, I know there's something in the subsets, and then there's a scurrying and a tapping of keyboards for about 10 minutes until someone goes, I found it. It wasn't where I expected. So let's have a look at a real example of interpreting the subsets. And one of the key things in level 2 or level 3 is that the train and the trackside are communicating over the radio network. It's all gone quiet. Is the trackside still there? Why haven't I got any more instructions? One of the things that the ETCS onboard is required to do is to monitor the safe radio session to make sure that it is receiving the messages it should be receiving. So in level 2 or 3, there is something called the safe radio session. And that starts by the ETCS onboard establishing a communication session over the GSMR data radio with the RBC. And that session allows the RBC to pass vital instructions to the train. And because those instructions appear at a random occasions, the ETCS onboard needs to know that it is still in communication. How does it know that it hasn't missed another vital instruction? So let's start with establishing that communication session. And because we're talking about an onboard talking to a trackside, could be multiple different suppliers, we have to have a clear specification of how that occurs. So we can start in chapter 3 of subset 26, where it states that only the onboard will establish a communication session. So a question for us, why can only the onboard establish the session? Well, this is to do with protecting the system against cyber attacks. The onboard is instructed by balises or the information that the driver enters to contact the trackside. And as part of that, we'll go through a security protocol. That means that the onboard is always talking to a trackside that it expects to talk to and expects to get instructions from. If it was possible for a trackside to contact the onboard, it would be possible for a hacker to establish a session with the onboard and send erroneous instructions. By making the connection always occur from the onboard, it reduces the risk of cyber attack. So who does the onboard call? Well, that is dictated, as I said, either by the driver entering the details of the RBC or by the onboard receiving a command from the trackside. If you're approaching an ETCS area, that will be from a balise group in the track. If you're moving between RBC areas, that will be instructions sent again from balises at the transition area. So we also need to make sure that only the correct onboards are talking to the correct trackside and vice versa. So we need to do some security checks. We all know how easy it is for that personal data to be stolen by people with phishing emails and the like. So the first question that both parties will ask themselves is, do I know who you are? So both the trackside and the onboard need to know about the other parties they're going to talk to. They need to have a list of valid people to contact or be contacted by. And having established a contact, you need to undertake some checks to make sure the person who says they're talking to you is the real person. And having undertaken those checks, we then need to understand how we can check that every message received is genuine. So the way this occurs is when the onboard contacts the trackside, it goes through a process of sharing secret passkeys with the trackside, and providing they can verify each other's identity, they can then generate a key which is used to authenticate all of the messages. Each message which is sent has an electronic signature attached to it, identifying the sender using this secret passcode. And if the receiver doesn't recognize the authentication, then it will reject the message. Useful to know that the messages are actually sent as plain text, and it is only the signature which is encrypted at the end. That makes it very easy for us monitoring the messages to be able to read what is being sent from the track to the train and vice versa. As I said, this could be between multiple onboards and tracksides, so we have to have a specification for that radio connection, for the security checks, and how the messages will be authenticated. And that is defined in another subset, subset 37, which is the Euro Radio Functional Interface Specification, or FIS. That document and some other documents deal with all of the low-level detail of how the radio session is established, the security checks, the message authentication, timings, and all the other parameters, all the things that telecoms engineers understand and signal engineers go, somebody else's problem. And for the ETCS, it is actually somebody else's problem. The Euro radio is just a module of the system. ETCS itself just uses that module as a communication channel. So going back to establishing a communication session. To get started, we need to set up that Euro radio communication, the grey bar at the top. That happens in the background automatically. It's continually being refreshed. Every time you change from one radio cell to another, there are reconnection events occurring. If the connection is lost, that will automatically reconnect itself. A whole load of things we don't need to worry about. Once that session is established, then the ETCS can begin its process of starting to communicate with the RBC. Subset 26, the ETCS specification, chapter 3, describes how this communication is established. Starts with the onboard sending a message to say that it wants to communicate. The trackside responds with a message saying what system versions, what language or detail of the language it's talking, and if everything is happy, then a session is established. So that's quite simple. Chapter 3 just tells us that's what happens. But actually, what are those messages? What is the more detailed process? So we now have to go and look in another part of subset 26, chapter 8, where it describes the messages which are transmitted. And in there, we'll find that there is a message 155, which is entitled the initiation of a communication session. Nice short little message, which is sent by the onboard to a specific RBC to say that it wants to establish a session. The RBC will then respond by sending back the version that the RBC is working to. The version that is sent back will be checked by the onboard to make sure the onboard can work with that version. Message 32 sent back from the trackside to the onboard. Providing the onboard is compatible with the version of the trackside, then a session establishment message will be sent from the onboard to the trackside. So a simple diagram in chapter 3 actually involves 3 messages, and those messages contain variables, and if you want to find out the details of those variables, they're all in chapter 7, subset 26. So you can see we're already looked at 3 different chapters just to get the radio session working. So now we're talking. The onboard is now in communication with the trackside, both a radio level and also at the ability to send information. But who else needs to know? Well, the driver needs to know. So the ETCS will display on the DMI, the driver machine interface, an icon, often called the wine glass, to show that there is a connection between the onboard and the trackside. So the whole fundamentals of ETCS is that safe instructions are issued by the trackside to the onboard. The movement authority is an authority to move. It is telling the onboard how far it is safe to move and at what speed. Of course, it's key that that movement authority is only known to be safe the moment it is received. After it has been received, things could change, and the movement authority might need to be altered or revoked. So we need to make sure that the onboard is always in communication with the trackside in case there is a change. Otherwise, nothing would happen if something else happened. So it's a little bit like, what often happens on Teams calls or Zoom calls or on your mobile phone. Can you hear me? How many times have we heard that on the train when we were allowed to travel? So at the base level, we are interested in the safe radio connection. That is the Euro radio connection. It's checking that the phone call is still connected and secure. The trackside and the onboard are in communication. That is the phone line layer. But there is also the session where we are talking about the messages. And here it is important that both parties believe that the other one is still there and active. And to do that, you need to hear things from the other party on a regular basis. So these 2 layers, the safe radio connection and the communication session, are monitored separately. So let's have a look at the safe radio connection. This, as I said, is managed by the Euroradio subsystem, described in subset 37. It's continually monitored both within the radio subsystem, but also by the ETCS onboard. And it is that which is displayed to the driver as the icon we saw. Provided the core radio system is working satisfactorily, then the driver will be advised that the connection is made. If, however, the connection is lost for a significant period of time, then the broken symbol in red will be displayed to the driver. So the ETCS onboard is monitoring the behavior of the Euro radio all the time and informing the driver of its status. The Euro radio has a lot of built-in functions. If it loses the telephone call, it will attempt to reconnect automatically, and it will repeat that reconnection on several occasions. It is unusual that it will fail to connect again, and you'll end up with the red broken connection symbol. So that is happening in the background by the subsystem. Turning to the communication session, this is monitored by the ETCS onboard. What it is looking for is messages being received on a regular basis. So when each message is received, it's a little bit like the countdown clock. It starts a countdown, 30 seconds or whatever. Will it get another message in that time? And if another message is received, the clock is reset. However, if the conundrum is a little bit too difficult and no more messages arrive, you could be out of time. If you're now out of time, the onboard cannot be certain that the information it is still stored is still valid. Something may have happened. The trackside may have tried to send an emergency stop message, but it hasn't been received. So the onboard needs to be monitoring the messages being received from the trackside and make a decision about when to react. And this is all detailed in chapter 3, 316, 341. You can see they have nice snappy reference IDs for the clauses. And here it is talking about looking for the last message, and if that was more than a certain period of time before the current time, then you need to react. And that time is set by a national value called T_NV contact. That's a value that the trackside sends to the onboards to tell them how to configure themselves for operation on that particular line. And this value can be set from anything from 0 seconds through to infinity. If that time expires, then the onboard needs to decide what reaction to take. And again, that reaction is defined in a national value. There are 3 possible reactions. The train could be tripped. A trip means that the emergency brake is applied, the train is brought to a stand in trip mode, and the driver has to acknowledge the trip before they can proceed. An alternative is to apply the service brake, which again brings the train to a stand, but the information stored on board is retained. And lastly, you can decide not to react. Not reacting could be seen as being a dangerous choice. However, it is all about likelihoods. How likely is it that after sending information to the train, authorizing a movement, that something will happen that means that you have to try and stop the train? And if you haven't got a message to the train, that the train needs to stop itself. If either of these the reactions, train trip or service brake, are applied, then the driver needs to know why the train is suddenly coming to a stand. And hence a message is displayed on the DMI communication error and that is relating back to the clause here we have got that 316.341 leading to a service break reaction will display that message, and going into trip will also, once you've got into trip, it will also display that same message. So we have got the safe radio session being monitored by the Euroradio, and we've also got the communication session being monitored by the ETCS, making sure that it gets valid messages from the trackside in short periods of time. But not everything is joined up in ETCS. TNV contact is often set to a value around about 30 seconds. Some countries set it to less, some to more, but the typical value would be around 30 seconds with a service break reaction if no message is received. And if that session fails, then the driver will get a message, communication error, and the brakes will be applied. But the safe radio connection icon remains displayed for 45 seconds after the last communication at the Euroradio level. So even though the driver may have the brakes applied and have a communication error on the screen, they may also have the safe radio connection icon still displayed. And it may be some time later before it goes to the broken symbol. So we've looked at the two layers of the radio system, the Euroradio and then the ETCS monitoring the flow of messages. And we've looked at how the onboard can react if it doesn't get a message within, say, 30 seconds. But ETCS doesn't always make these reactions, and we need to look in other parts of the subsets to understand when this functionality is available. If we turn to subset 26, section 4.5.2, we can find the function of checking the safe radio connection. And we can see that it says that it only applies in levels 2 and 3. So if the train is not in level 2 or 3, this function is not active. It also tells us through the X's in the columns that it only applies in certain modes, in this case FS, LS and OS, the three modes where a movement authority is held and is applicable for the movement. So chapter 4 is telling us which levels and which modes this particular function is active in. However, the statements in chapter 3 that we were looking at to understand how TNV contact and the reaction could be applied don't mention those exceptions. It implies in chapter 3 that this function is always on and always working. It doesn't mention that it doesn't apply to standby or to staff responsible or any of the other modes. So we've seen a bit of chapter 3, we've seen some chapter 4, we've looked in chapter 8. Where shall we go next? Well, one of the problems with ETCS is that it is quite expensive to get good radio coverage everywhere, and there may be locations where it is not practical. Where it may be practical are perhaps some tunnels, some very rural areas, which may make it very expensive to provide good coverage, or of course from time to time the network may fail. And if the network fails, we have no network. So the reaction of the train, if there is no network, is to try and re-establish the communication session. That's the Euroradio function. But if no messages are being received over the Euroradio, then the train will react safely by applying the reaction to the loss of communication. So we bring the train to a stand with the service brake, perhaps, in an area where there's no radio coverage because the network has failed, which means that we can't move the train because it has no radio coverage to get a movement authority, and the driver cannot speak to the signaller because GSMR is the same radio network we use for our voice calls. So we have a stranded train. Not what we want, and is going to cause problems recovering. Particularly if we actually know that there is a hole in the radio coverage, an area where radio coverage cannot be guaranteed, or either because it is expensive or difficult, or because perhaps a GSMR cell has failed. Now, in deciding how much coverage to have, we need to think about what are the risks of the train not being in communication. Well, the first thing is that ETCS onboards do not allow trains to be moved without authority. That is normally through a movement authority, although the driver can override the system. At the time a movement authority is issued, we know it is safe. And now we can think about why it might become unsafe for that movement authority to still be applied. What are the reasons that might occur for the signaller or for the system to want to stop the train in emergency? How likely is that event to occur at the same time that the train is not in communication? Very much holes in the Swiss cheese. Given that the number of emergency calls that are made by the signaller nationally, and given how often trains are not in communication, it's probably a very small risk. The question is, how do we quantify it? But let us decide that it is not practical to provide full radio coverage and we need to have a radio hole. So the ETCS trackside can send a message to the onboard advising of the location of a potential radio hole. Radio hole boundaries are not black and white. They often depend on atmospheric conditions and other effects. So the signal will slowly drop out as you go into the hole from the previous transmitter perhaps, and may well be established before you have left the hole at the other end. The reaction of the onboard to being told about a radio hole is that if the communication is lost, the train will not react and the driver can proceed with the remainder of the stored movement authority. And as soon as the onboard believes it has left the radio hole, it will make an attempt to reconnect. And if it can't reconnect within the TNV contact time, it will then react as if communication has been lost. And that is described in chapter 3 of subset 26. Now the question is, how do we tell the train? So we need to go and look in other parts of the subset for the information. Now you might expect that there is a specific packet or a message that covers it. But if we look in chapter 8 at all the messages that the trackside can send to the train, and we look in chapter 7 at the list of packets, and we look for something that says radio hole, we will not find any matches. So time to scratch our heads a little bit. We need to go on a hunt for a radio hole. So let's go back to chapter 3, which talks about the behavior of the train and particularly the communication session. And we will find that there is a nice helpful clause that tells us about the onboard behavior when it believes it is within the radio hole. Once the is inside the hole, it will stop the supervision of the safe radio connection, and it will not attempt to generate a reaction until it has left the radio hole and the connection has been re-established. But it still doesn't tell us how the radio hole should be announced. So we're going to have to go and do some more hunting around in the subsets. So one of the places to look is obviously a message or a packet that is going to be sent from the trackside to the train. We've looked at the list of messages, no match. We've looked at the list of packets, no match. Perhaps it is hidden in the contents of one of the packets. So if we do a word search in chapter 7 for radio hole, we end up with one match in section 75177, and it is a potential value for a variable m underscore track condition. If that value is set, it is something to describing a radio hole. So now we know what is going to be the mechanism for sending the information. It is going to be by sending a packet which contains that variable. So we now can go and look for the packet that sends a track condition. And we'll find that that is packet 68. It can send a variety of track conditions about neutral sections, powerless sections, the need to change traction, current, or it can include a radio hole. And we can see there's quite a lot of information that can be included in this packet. But what does it all mean? Well, the key bits for us are the distance from the LRBG to the start of the radio hole, D underscore track condition, and the length of the radio hole, L underscore track condition. So this is defining the area to which the track condition function will apply, and that is described by setting M underscore track condition to 0100 in binary, which equals a radio hole. So this is the way that the ETCS trackside sends the information to the onboard using a packet 68 described in chapter 7 of subset 26. Now, packets of information can be sent either from balises or from the RBC over the radio link. So perhaps we need to look at how packet 68 can be sent to the train. Can we use a balise group to send that packet? We can now turn to chapter 4 of subset 26 to find out whether the information will be accepted. Track conditions, excluding big metal mass, can be sent either from the RBC or from balise groups, depending on the level that the train is operating in. And you'll see that in this instance, if you look at levels 2 and 3, it is rejected if it does not come from the RBC. And it is only accepted if it comes from the RBC as part of a Euroradio message. So in levels 2 and 3, you cannot use a balise group to send information relating to a radio hole. So now we need to send it over the Euroradio, and that means a Euroradio message. But which message? Well, let's go and have a look and see if there's a message relating to sending track conditions. Nope, doesn't appear to be. If we scan all the way down the list, we won't find that there's any message which specifically relates to sending a track condition. However, a lot of radio messages can include packets, so perhaps we might find packet 68 listed as one of the packets that can be sent with one of these messages. You'll see that the only message that has the ability to include packet 68 is an infill movement authority at the bottom. All of the others don't mention 68. However, a number of the messages, the movement authority, the general message, and the MA with shifted location do mention something called common optional packets. And referring to another part of Chapter 8, we find that those common optional packets includes 68. So that means that we can use any of the messages which include the common optional packets to send packet 68 the track conditions. So the normal way would be to send that as part of the movement authority. And if we think about it, that makes sense. The function of monitoring the communication session is only valid when the train has a movement authority, is working in FS, OS or LS. Therefore, sending the radio hole information with that movement authority is logical. So the next question we need to ask is, what will the onboard do when it receives that information? Will it accept and process the information? Well, the first thing is that we are sending it over the radio. So that's a big tick. However, we also need to consider whether it will be accepted in the relevant modes. So we can refer to another part of Chapter 4, 484, which is the acceptive information based on the mode that the train is operating in. And we can see that the information will be accepted in a good number of modes. They're all the modes at which a movement authority could also be accepted and would be processed. So that's good. The onboard will accept the information. We now need to just think a little bit about the scope of the subsets before we move on. Most of the subsets apply to the ETCS onboard, principally chapters 3, 4, 5, 7 and 8 of subset 26 all define the normal behavior of the ETCS onboard, and our interface to the driver is covered by the ETCS drive machine interface standard. The ETCS trackside sits off to one side, and the specifications do not describe in full what the ETCS trackside should do. Sometimes we do get prescriptive instructions in the trackside specifications. At a level transition, the order balise group shall, a mandatory command, be placed with an immediate level transition order. However, in most instances, we will find references such as the trackside can order the onboard to do something. We have to make a decision. So we've got a good specification for the onboard, but when it comes to the trackside, it's much more optional, including, are we going to send a radio hole? That is something that the trackside we can decide to do or not, in the same way that we can decide what value to set the national value to. So let's go back to our train, our onboard. Remember, the onboard is sort of living in its own little blindfolded world. It doesn't know very much, but it has been told there is a radio hole. And it's been told that the location of that radio hole is referenced to the LRBG, which it is previously reported to the trackside. We now need to think about what the onboard should do with that information. Well, the first thing to do is to warn the driver. And we can look in the DMI specification and we'll find that it defines a symbol, and that symbol is the sort of crossed out radio transmitter at the 1,000-meter mark in the planning area of the DMI. So the driver knows that they're coming up to a potential radio hole. Don't know what they do about it. Not sure if they're that bothered, but it could tell them that there could be a communication problem in that area. But that is just warning the driver. What is the system going to do? Or how is it going to manage that indication? Well, chapter 5 of subset 26 has a diagram which describes a radial hole. It shows the distance from the LRBG as being the distance to the start of the radial hole, and the length of the radial hole being the area of it. And whilst in that area, that is when the system will display to the driver that it is in a radial hole. So to pass through a radial hole, the process is described in chapter 5. It talks about the automatic deactivation of the supervision of the safe radio connection. It starts to the process when the max safe front end of the train gets to the start location of the radial hole, at which point the radial hole indication is to be displayed to the driver. And the end of the radial hole is when the min safe rear end of the train leaves the radial hole, at which point the indication is removed. During the passage through the radial hole, the driver will see a radial hole indication underneath the speedometer, and after a period of time, if the session is lost, then they'll see the safe radio connection broken symbol underneath the level indication to indicate to them that the system is out of communication. So that part of chapter 5 has described how the indications are displayed, how is actually the radio system supervised in that radio hole, and for that we need to go back to chapter 3. And we find in chapter 3 how the supervision of the safe radio connection is managed by the onboard. And the key statement is that the onboard is continually monitoring the time between the messages, and it uses a timestamp to do that. And if that difference in time exceeds TMV contact, then the reaction is applied. And we've seen that already on an earlier slide. However, there is then a sub-clause that says as long as the front of the train is within an announced radio hole, the ERTMS shall stop the supervision of the safe radio connection. So as soon as the train detects that it is into the radio hole, and it was the max safe front end we saw in the previous information from chapter 5, then it will stop that process. And afterwards, until a new message is received, it will only look for a message after it has left the radio hole. That last paragraph can be quite hard to read because it would be much easier just to say that the timer restarts when you leave the radio hole, which is actually what it is saying. It is saying that the onboard time when you've left the radio hole is the time that you use to start the timer looking for the next message. But in good old subset words, it is not as easy always to understand what it's trying to say. So the supervision of the safe radio session is terminated while we're in the radio hole. When we leave the radio hole, then we start looking for a message, and if we don't get it within the right period of time, then there will be the reaction. So what's going to make sure that we have re-established the session with the RBC? Well, there is another clause also in chapter 3 that says that the onboard shall establish a communication session in a number of circumstances, and the one in red is that when the train front reaches the end of announced radio hole. So as soon as the train thinks it has reached the end of the radio hole, it will start to try and re-establish that session. In the meantime, the Euro radio will have been working away in the background, continually monitoring whether there's GSMR coverage, and as soon as it finds coverage, it will have been attempting to re-establish the low-level communication session, the telephone call underneath. So we've been dotting around between the various chapters of subset 26. We've looked in chapter 3, the principles. We've looked in chapter 5 for some of the procedures. We've looked in 7 and 8 for the messages and the packets and the variables. And we've looked in chapter 4 to understand when the information will be accepted. And that is just for something as simple as a radio hole. If you start looking at some of the more complicated things that happen in ETCS, you'll find that you can be jumping between each of the chapters several times in order to get a full understanding, and knowing where to look is always a challenge. One of the other challenges is to interpret which of the statements in the various chapters are mandatory, which apply to the trackside and which apply to the onboard. Baseline 3, Release 2 introduced a new section. Chapter 9 of subset 26 classifies all of the clauses. So for each clause in the other chapters, it tells us whether the requirement applies to the ETCS onboard, to the ETCS trackside, whether it is just a definition, whether it is information, or whether it is an other. So just in a small section of chapter 3, you can see there's one requirement on the trackside, and most of the requirements are actually onto the onboard. Learning your way around the subset 26 and the other subsets takes a lot of time. Nearly all of the experts struggle to find information when they're looking for it, and the best way to find the information is probably to ask an expert. However, it is worth spending the time getting a feel for the documents so that if you do need to find information, you can find it. So having started as our mouse entering the maze of subset 26, having followed our way through, we have actually managed to get to the finish.